The majestic villa stood on a hill overlooking the city, glistening in the setting sun. Anna Werner, known for her refined tastes and unwavering conviction, tapped her heels nervously on the marble floor of the living room. Her face was contorted with an anger rarely seen this day. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she shouted, her voice echoing through the spacious room. Her eyes threw lightning bolts, her gaze stopping on the group of people gathered in front of her. In front of her stood Clara, her maid, and a boy of about 12, the son of one of the housekeepers. Beside him, barely holding back tears, stood his mother, Martha, who usually held herself with pride, but today her look betrayed anxiety. "Mrs. Werner," Martha began, trying to speak calmly, "please, it must be a misunderstanding." Max couldn't. Anna interrupted her with a cold chuckle. "A misunderstanding? You dare say that to me after I saw with my own eyes your son trotting his gaze around my room the last time you were here? And now that my necklace is gone, you want to convince me of his innocence? Don't be ridiculous, Martha." The boy, who had been silent until then, took a step forward. His hands trembled, but there was determination in his eyes. "I didn't take your necklace, Mrs. Werner," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Nor did I go into your room after we helped you take out the old trunk." Anna, not listening, turned to Clara again. "You, Clara, were here, you were supposed to keep order. How could you let this happen? Or are you covering for him too?" Clara turned pale, but gathered all her courage. "Mistress, I'm sure it's just a mistake. Max is an honest boy, and—" "Enough." Anna raised her hand, cutting her off. "I will not tolerate stealing, much less lying, in my house." Martha pulled Max against her, her eyes glistening with tears of resentment and helplessness. She knew that words wouldn't help in this situation, but she couldn't keep silent. "Anna, please think again. We've worked here for years, and you've always trusted us. Max would never do something like this." Anna pressed her lips into a thin line, her gaze remaining cold and aloof. "Trust? Trust is something that breaks in an instant, Martha. One false step and everything that's been built up over the years is jeopardized. You know how hard it is to keep a reputation. And now that my reputation is at stake, I can't afford to be soft." Max trembled, feeling everyone's attention focused on him. His face flamed with shame, but he could do nothing but squeeze his mother's hand tighter. His eyes met Clara's, a mixture of sympathy and fear. She wanted to say something, but knew that any word could only make her worse. Anna cast a scornful glance around the room. "Martha," she said with a note of cold superiority, "you must realize that the consequences will be serious. If you can't explain where my pendant is, and if none of you can, then someone will have to answer for it." There was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Tears ran down Martha's cheeks, but she wiped them away with a quick movement and looked at Anna with despair. "I'm willing to do everything in my power to find your pendant. Just give us a little time." Anna hummed, her gaze drifting back to the window as if the conversation was over. "Time is a luxury I can't afford," she said, almost in a whisper, but everyone in the room heard her words. "Anna, Max, and I are going to stay here and look for your pendant. We're not leaving until we find it. Please give us a chance to prove our innocence." Max looked at his mother hopefully, his eyes full of pleading. He knew words meant little in this situation, but the silence seemed even more depressing. Anna watched them carefully, her expression softening for a moment, but she quickly returned to her previous icy calm. "All right," she finally said, crossing her arms over her chest. "You have 1 hour. If you don't find the pendant in that time, I'll be forced to take action. And believe me, they will be severe." Clara, who had been standing back all this time, felt relief, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. She knew that an hour was too short to find anything, especially if Mac hadn't actually taken the jewelry. But she remained silent, realizing that her words wouldn't change Mistress's mind. Martha nodded, though her face remained tense, and gently led Max to another part of the room, where they began going through every shelf, every corner, trying to find anything that might justify them. The clock ticked louder and louder, it seemed to be counting down the last few minutes of peace. Anna watched them from her seat, her thoughts occupied with very different concerns. It wasn't just the necklace that bothered her, but a feeling she couldn't explain. As if this was not just an incident, but something more, something that concerned not only the mother and her son, but herself. Max kept searching, his hands shaking as he went through the things on the shelves. He couldn't believe he was in the middle of such a nightmare. Anna sat in the chair, calmly waiting for the denouement of this unpleasant story. There was a coldness in the room that grew more palpable by the minute as her gaze focused more and more on the mother and son. Time stretched unbearably slow. Every minute was torture for her, and her thoughts kept returning to the missing pendant. This situation went beyond the usual domestic quarrel, turning into something much more important. Perhaps even fateful. Martha stood with her fists clenched. She tried to reassure her son, but her face betrayed her anxiety. Anna shook her head at everything she said. She didn't believe it could be a misunderstanding, and her conviction was unshakable. Max continued to search the corners of the room, trying to find anything that might justify his innocence. He opened closets, going through things, but found nothing. His heart was beating faster and faster. He knew that every move he made was under scrutiny, and this situation was a nightmare for him. He couldn't understand how the jewel had ended up in his backpack, but his words couldn't convince the woman who stood across from him. "I didn't take it, honestly," he repeated to his mother. "I didn't touch it, Mom." "Why won't anyone believe it?" Martha nodded weakly, trying to show her son that she believed in his innocence. She knew that now her every word had to be carefully considered. But even she realized that Anna was not so easy to fight against. The woman was too powerful and cruel. Every look she gave her was like a sentence. Clara, standing a little to the side, felt her gut clench at what was happening. She had known this family for years and couldn't believe things could change so quickly. But still, it was hard for her to stand still and watch as the boy tried to justify himself and his mother watched helplessly. And so, as the tension reached its peak, the doorbell rang. Anna rose from her chair and, without waiting for Clara to open it, headed for the exit herself. She couldn't wait any longer. Her eyes were already burning with determination. "It's them," she said through gritted teeth. "Let them in here." Clara walked slowly to the door and opened it. Two policemen stood in the hallway. They were not in uniform, but in civilian clothes, which only added to the severity of their appearance. One of them was tall and dark-haired, with an expression that didn't bode well. The other was shorter, with a stern look. "Good evening, Mrs. Werner," said one of the policemen, addressing Anna, who was standing at the door. "We've come at your call." "What happened?" Anna looked at them, her voice cold and confident. "That boy stole a pendant from me," she said, pointing to Max, who was standing next to his mother. "I found it in his backpack. Now you have to decide what to do with it." The policemen looked at each other. The man standing behind them took a step forward and walked over to Max. "Do you realize that you are charged with theft, boy?" he asked sternly, looking at him. Max felt his legs shaking. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Only scraps of thoughts flashed through his mind. He knew that his words would not change the situation, that perhaps not even his mother could help. Martha, losing patience, stepped forward and tried to intervene. "We realize this looks strange, but my son is innocent. I beg you, give us a chance to prove it. He can't be guilty." The policeman looked at her, but didn't answer. He kept looking at Max. "We understand your concern," said the second policeman. "But right now we're going to have to do some questioning. We need to find out how that pendant ended up in your backpack." Max opened his mouth again, but could not utter a word. His body was trembling, he felt his throat tighten with fear and despair. "No, I didn't take him. I don't know how it got there," he cried out, unable to contain his emotions. But no one listened to him. The policemen exchanged glances, and there was no doubt in their eyes. They turned to Anna, who was standing a little behind. "We have to go through the official procedure." "Take him with us," said one of the policemen. Max felt his hand find itself in the tight grip of one of the policemen. His heart skipped a beat, and he realized that this was a reality that would leave him no chance. Martha took a step back, shocked at what was happening. "But, you can't take him away!" she shrieked, jumping up on the spot. "He's my son. Where's your sympathy?" The policeman looked at her with regret, but answered coldly. "We understand your pain, but the law is the law. You need to come with us now." Max felt himself being pulled behind him. The policeman held his arm, giving him no chance to free himself. His heart was pounding like crazy. Every word his mother said seemed to lose meaning. He tried to break free, but his movement was helpless, restrained by the policeman's hand. "Don't take him away!" Martha cried out again, but her voice sounded already like a confession, like total loss. She tried to catch up with the policeman, but Max could not stop. He felt his mother squeeze his shoulder and pull, but he was already being led toward the door. Anna watched this, her gaze growing even colder. She didn't feel the slightest regret, only satisfaction that everything was going according to her plan. Everything in this house always obeyed her rules, and this time was no exception. She took a step back, giving the police officers a chance to carry out their process. "We won't keep him long," one of the policemen said without looking at Anna. "This is a formality. The boy will be taken to the station for questioning, and a decision will be made based on the results." Max felt himself being led down the corridor, his feet barely touching the floor. There was only one question in his mind: what is happening? Why is this happening to him? He couldn't believe it was all real. "I'm not guilty!" he shouted out again, hoping someone would hear him. He looked at Clara, who was standing in the doorway. She looked at him silently, her face filled with pain and unspeakable regret. She couldn't help it. Marta tried to rejoin the conversation, but her words were meaningless. The policeman paid no attention to her. As soon as Max was on the doorstep, her fear and pain came over her in a wave of despair. "Please don't take him away!" she screamed, but it was too late. The door behind them slammed shut with a sharp sound. Max stood in front of the police car, not realizing what was happening. His hands were clenched into fists, but he didn't know where to put them. How could this have happened? Why was he in this situation? "Please don't take me away." "I didn't," he repeated again, but there was no answer. Thoughts flashed through his mind that couldn't find a way out. He felt his heart clench. All his attempts to justify himself made no difference. He was guilty in everyone's eyes, and no one believed him. The police escorted him to his car, and within minutes they were driving through the night city. In the back seat, Max was barely visible. He clenched his hands, trying to hold back the tears that never came. Everything that was happening was too much for him to comprehend. In this emptiness and despair, his mother sat beside him, her face contorted with grief, and nothing could comfort her. At this moment she felt completely helpless. Words could not save her, and even her own feelings could not change the course of events. Max sat in the car, feeling time and space shrinking around him. Everything he knew about justice and truth seemed to shatter, and the only thing left was a feeling of helplessness. The police car moved through the deserted streets of the city, and with every meter Max felt his world shrinking. Everything that had recently seemed familiar and understandable was now alien and frightening. The street he lived on, the people he interacted with, all of it became part of some distant life. Now he was in the center of a nightmare from which there was no escape. The car was quiet, only the sound of the engine running pierced the silence. Max sat there, unable to utter a word. His eyes were staring out the window, where the darkness and the lights of the streets floated by. A hurricane of emotions raged inside him: anger, fear, confusion. He felt his soul torn by injustice, but despite it all, he was helpless. His whole world had shrunk to those few square meters in the police car. "Don't worry, we'll sort it out," said the policeman who was sitting next to him in the front seat. He tried to smile, but there was no sincerity in his eyes. Max felt that his words were an empty formality, an attempt to comfort someone who was doomed. Max didn't answer, couldn't find the strength to speak. He sat with his lips pressed together and remained silent. This whole journey, everything that was happening to him, seemed like some strange game in which he had become a victim. Why didn't anyone listen to him? Why didn't anyone believe him? All he wanted was to just go home, back to the life that had seemed so simple and peaceful just yesterday. Martha sat in the hallway of the house, unable to come to terms with what had happened. Every moment of her life was now racked with terror and hopelessness. As the door closed behind the police officers, she felt her world crumble. She couldn't believe that her son, her Max, was in this situation. She thought there was room for justice and trust in this house, in this life. But as it turned out, she was wrong. We can't just sit back. Martha burst out of the room, turning to Clara. We have to do something. I'm not going to let them take my son. Clara was dumbfounded. She hadn't expected this from Marta, but seeing her determination, she nodded. We have to find a way to prove his innocence, Clara said, realizing that their situation was hopeless. However, she knew that if they didn't take decisive steps, Max really couldn't see any light at the end of this tunnel. Martha tried to think of what to do. She knew her options were limited, but she couldn't allow her son to end up in such a prison from which there would be no escape. She remembered Max's words again. He wasn't a thief, he couldn't be a thief. It would be unnatural for her son. But what if her words were not heeded? What if Anna decided she had to take control and ruin their lives? An hour later, the police car pulled up in front of the precinct building. Max was led out of the car and headed inside, despite his fears. He knew that now he would have a long road ahead of him, interrogation, perhaps humiliation. But that wasn't what was most frightening. He didn't know what he had to do to get out of this situation alive, without a taint of guilt. As soon as he entered the building, he was greeted by several staff members. There was no warmth on their faces. Max felt everything around him becoming more and more hostile and unclear. Max sat down, feeling his hands start to shake. He was offered water, but he did not take it. He was offered water, but he couldn't drink, he was too nervous. He waited for the interrogation to begin, as what was supposed to be the most important moment of his life. But no one was in a hurry to begin. Instead, the police officers exchanged glances among themselves, as if everything that was happening was some part of the normal routine. So, Max, began the same policeman who was sitting next to him in the car, tell me how the pendant ended up in your backpack. Max wanted to say something, but there was a lump in his throat. He knew that his words would not be heard. He could only repeat one thing, that he hadn't taken the pendant, that he hadn't done anything. But those words meant nothing. I don't know how it got there, he said, though he felt inside that this truth was not convincing. He felt his own words losing power as his world crumbled before his eyes. The policeman looked at him in disbelief. You didn't know? He repeated, as if he himself could not believe what he was hearing. Max felt his heart clench. He was surrounded by walls from which there were no doors or windows. All he could do was sit and wait. Back in the house again. Martha stood at the window, her gaze directed into the darkness. She couldn't wait for this night to end. Every sound outside the window seemed like a threat. Every shadow a portent of trouble. She couldn't let it happen, but she didn't know how to stop this ruthless course of events. Her mind kept replaying the moments when she'd talked to Max, when he'd sworn he hadn't done anything. She'd believed him. But how strong was her faith if the whole world around them didn't? Max sat in a chair in the police office, feeling his body grow heavy with tension. The bench in front of him was empty, and the glass walls of the office only added to the feeling of confinement. He looked at his hands, which were trembling, and tried to keep his thoughts in order so he wouldn't go mad with fear. It had been hours since he had been taken from his home. It was as if time had slowed down in this cold room, and every moment pulled him into an even deeper pit of despair. He couldn't understand how he had ended up here, how his life could have changed so drastically. His thoughts darted from one thought to the next, but it all came down to one thing: no one could hear him anyway. The door opened and a policeman entered the office, tall and with a stern expression. He was reserved, and his gaze betrayed no emotion. "Well, Max," he said, sitting down opposite. "Shall we begin? You realize you need to tell me how that pendant ended up in your backpack." Max sat silent. His heart was pounding and his breathing was intermittent. He didn't know what to say. All he could say was the truth that he hadn't taken the pendant, but would anyone hear that? He felt his words losing power and his mind filled with confusion. "I don't know how it got there," Max said barely audibly, almost in a whisper, as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. "I swear I didn't take it." The policeman did not answer at once. He stared at the boy intently, showing no emotion. Max tried to avoid his gaze, but he couldn't. There was an emptiness in his chest, and inside everything kept hurting from the injustice. "Do you realize that this doesn't sound very true?" The policeman continued. "We found the pendant in your backpack. Do you have an explanation? Can you tell us something?" Max felt his throat constrict and tears came to his eyes. He tried to answer again, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was a hazy picture, and his fear was only getting worse. "I don't know how he got there," Max repeated, but his voice didn't sound so sure anymore. He felt like he was losing control of the situation. He didn't know what to say, and he couldn't find an answer that could satisfy them. The policeman paused and leaned forward, as if trying to figure out what was going on in this boy's mind. His gaze was merciless, and Max felt a heavy weight of guilt pressing down on him. "Do you realize that this is a serious situation?" the policeman asked. "Stealing jewelry is a felony, and you're facing a real sentence. You need to tell us what happened." "We hear you, Max, but if you don't tell the truth, things will only get worse." Max closed his eyes, not knowing what to do. His breathing became more and more rapid and his mind seemed to disconnect from reality. He couldn't believe that he was being accused. All he did was study, help his mother around the house, and never intended to become a criminal. Suddenly, when he felt he couldn't keep quiet any longer, the door opened again and another man entered the office. It was a man in a suit, with a confident and calm expression. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Hi, Max," he said, walking over to the boy and taking a seat next to him. His voice was soft and calm, which immediately gave Max a sense of slight hope. "I'm your lawyer, and I'm here to help you." Max subtly turned his head toward his new interlocutor. He was amazed at how this man had suddenly appeared in his life, but there was genuine confidence in his eyes. Although fear and confusion never left him, the lawyer's presence offered at least a small measure of comfort. The lawyer looked at the policeman. "I think we should suspend the questioning," he said firmly. "My client does not yet realize the gravity of the situation and needs counseling. I insist that the interrogation be suspended until I appear." The policeman gave the lawyer a displeased look, but finally nodded. "All right," he said, standing up. "We'll continue this later. I hope you'll cooperate, Max." As soon as the policeman left the office, the lawyer turned to Max. "Don't worry, we're with you," he said, with a slight smile that seemed to shine in this dark room. "Let's talk calmly. You need to tell me the whole truth." Max exhaled, though he still couldn't understand what was going on. The lawyer's words were like a faint spark of light at the end of the tunnel for him, but all he could do was remain silent. He didn't know what to expect, and his mind was filled with fog. The lawyer continued, no longer hiding the concern in his voice. "I'm sure we can work this out. You have to understand, if you're honest, if you tell the truth, it will help you. I'm on your side." Max looked at the lawyer again, and there was a faint hope in his heart. His mind was still all gloomy, but this man standing in front of him brought some spark of confidence. "I don't know how the pendant ended up in my backpack," he whispered at last, and there seemed to be both remorse and despair in his voice. The lawyer, listening intently, leaned forward. We'll find out, Max. The main thing is to speak honestly, and we'll find a way out of this situation. You're not alone, remember that. The lawyer sat next to Max, scrutinizing his face, trying to catch every emotion, every gesture. He knew that in front of him was a child who, despite his explanations, felt cornered. This interrogation was a real ordeal for Max, and the lawyer was the only person who could give him some hope. Max calmed down a little, but his inner tension did not let go. He kept thinking about how he had ended up in this situation. How could it be that his life, which seemed so ordinary and calm, was suddenly turned upside down? Are you sure you don't know how the pendant ended up in your backpack? The lawyer continued, his voice soft but insistent. We can't make assumptions. You need to tell us exactly what happened. Do you understand? Max nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. He didn't know what to think or what to say. Everything was all mixed up in his head. How could this have happened? He didn't know how the pendant ended up in his backpack. He definitely remembered just sitting in the living room, doing his homework and talking to his mother. How could this all turn into a nightmare? The lawyer noticed his confusion and paused to give Max time to calm down. He knew that the best way to get at the truth was not to push, but to create an atmosphere of trust. Max, he continued after a pause, you and I are on the same side now. I'm not going to judge you. Your job is to just tell me what happened. You realize that we can make sense of this situation if you're honest. It's important. Max looked up. The lawyer's words sounded calm, and there was some confidence in them. It gave him strength, but it was still too hard to open his soul. He knew he had to tell, but he was afraid it might lead to more trouble. I don't know, he finally said, and there was confusion in his voice. I didn't take it, I swear. I just don't understand how it got there. The lawyer nodded, making a note in his notebook. He was determined. Okay, he said with a slight sigh of relief. You say you didn't know how it got there. That's a start. You're not alone, and you and I will figure out what happened. But remember, in cases like this, it's important not only to tell the truth, but to prove your innocence. Let's try to do it right. At that time, the office door opened and the policeman who had questioned Max earlier entered the room. He looked at the lawyer with slight displeasure, but did not say anything. We are ready to continue, the policeman said, starting another interrogation. But the lawyer was not going to back down. No, he answered firmly, standing up. I insist on a recess. My client needs time to recover. I can't allow the interrogation to continue until he's ready. The policeman pressed his lips together but did not argue. He silently left the office, leaving Max and the lawyer alone. Max felt his tense muscles begin to relax. He realized that the lawyer was now on his side, and that gave him a small but necessary hope. Every day, more and more Max was gripped by a sense of dread of what might be done to him. But now, at least temporarily, he wasn't alone. You realize that the most important thing now is to take your time, the lawyer continued. You mustn't rush your answers. If you don't remember how it happened, just tell us. We're not going to pressure you. It's important for us to find the truth, not to make you say things that are out of character. Max looked at the lawyer and a spark of gratitude appeared in his eyes. This man wasn't judging him. He wasn't drawing any conclusions, he was just speaking the truth. That was important to Max, because it was the truth that he was waiting for. Even if it wasn't there in this situation, at least knowing that someone understood was reassuring to him. Thank you, Max whispered, and for the first time in a long time he felt relieved. It was a small victory, but it was an important one. Meanwhile, across town, Martha sat by the window, worrying over every minute of it. She couldn't stay calm. Every hour her son spent in the police station felt like agony. She tried to find a way to make sense of it, but her strength was running out. Her faith in justice was being questioned and it was weighing on her. She thought about how Max needed to explain what had happened and how they could work things out. She tried to see if her faith in him and the fact that he was innocent could help them get out of this nightmare. But despite her internal struggle, she felt that the justice she believed in was now at risk. It was hard to accept that her son had become part of a system in which he could be unheard. And every moment, every glance at the clock only reinforced her anxiety. The courtroom was filled with tension. The people who had come for the trial filled every corner, their whispers and quiet conversations creating an atmosphere of anticipation. At the center of everything was Max, who couldn't understand how he had ended up in this place. His head was spinning and every step seemed heavy, as if he was moving through a deep swamp. Fear clutched his chest and his heart was pounding frantically. He stood among the accused, surrounded by prosecutors, lawyers, and judges, who seemed to look at him as if he were a villain, not a child who did not understand the consequences of what was happening. There were many people in the hall, and each of them was putting pressure on the child. At the judge's table sat a middle-aged man, wearing a strict black suit. His face was serious, with no sign of empathy or compassion, only a cold determination that no matter the outcome of the case, justice would be served. His gaze was as sharp as a knife blade, and Max felt that his every word would be listened to like a verdict. The judge was the first to speak, his voice echoing distantly off the walls of the hall. All present fell silent, and attention focused on his figure. "We are starting the trial for theft, and the accused is the minor Max Lehman," the judge said. His words carried not only officialism, but a heaviness that immediately came over everyone. Today the testimony of the parties will be heard. Max felt himself overcome with excitement. His gaze slid around the hall, he looked for support but couldn't find it. He felt more alone than ever. The only people behind him were the lawyer and his mother, who were trying to remain calm, but their faces were tense. The judge nodded to the prosecutor and he rose from his seat to begin his address. His face was stony and his speech seemed to have been rehearsed in advance. He walked confidently to the podium, taking his time to make his accusations. This man was not just a prosecutor, he was the man who could send Max to jail, and that feeling was unbearably heavy for the boy. "Your Honor, distinguished members of the court," the prosecutor began, his voice sounding confident and firm, "we are dealing with a classic crime. The theft of jewelry committed by a minor is a serious crime that requires punishment. There is all the evidence in this case to prove the guilt of the accused." Max squirmed in his chair, his hands starting to sweat. The prosecutor's words were running through his mind, and although he didn't want to believe it, it seemed to him that everything was against him. He didn't know how to fix this, how to prove his innocence. Everything seemed doomed. The prosecutor continued, addressing the judge. "We will present evidence that the accused was not only present at the theft, but was directly involved in it. We have proven that the pendant was found in his backpack. This is the key evidence that supports his guilt." The prosecutor's every word was like a punch to the Max. He sat stunned, trying to hide his tears. His inner world was crumbling before his eyes, and he couldn't figure out what to do. He couldn't imagine how he would live after this, how he would recover from this prison. Max's lawyer, a man with a kind and calm face, stood up to answer. He knew his client was in a difficult situation, and this was a much more complicated case than it seemed at first glance. The lawyer didn't know how this trial would unfold, but he was ready to fight. "Your Honor, distinguished members of the court," he began, his voice firm but with a note of respect. "We do not deny that the pendant was found in my client's backpack. But my client claims that he did not know how the pendant ended up in his backpack. We believe that there is no direct evidence that he was involved in the crime. In addition, given his age and psychological state, we insist that the court take into account all the circumstances of the case and impose a more humane punishment." The prosecutor looked at the lawyer with displeasure, and the judge only nodded, listening to their arguments. "And where is the evidence of innocence?" The prosecutor appealed again. "We have already heard from the mouth of the accused that he does not remember anything. Isn't that an admission that he is really guilty but is trying to avoid punishment by deceiving the court?" The lawyer raised his hand to indicate that he wanted to answer, and the judge gave him the floor. "My client maintains that he is not guilty. We ask the court to take into account his minority, as well as his incomplete realization of all the consequences of his actions. We insist that the case be reviewed in light of all the circumstances, and that Max not be punished so harshly. Max felt his throat constrict and he could barely breathe. His lawyer was saying all the right things, but no one seemed to believe him. Everything seemed to be going against him. The judge was silent, listening intently. He was the man who made the decisions on which fate depended, but his face remained cold and impenetrable. "We will continue the hearing in half an hour," the judge said, rising from his seat. "All parties have the right to present their evidence. The hearing is suspended for the time being." The courtroom was filled with whispers. People began to leave, discussing what was happening. Max, not knowing what to do, stood up from his seat. The lawyer and his mother approached him. He felt like a lost child in the midst of an adult world that wasn't ready for this ordeal. "Don't worry, Max," the lawyer said, holding his gaze. "We're with you. We'll do everything we can to prove your innocence." Max nodded, but his eyes were full of doubt. The courtroom gradually emptied and the tense silence that reigned in the room seemed unbearable. Max, standing among the lawyer and his mother, felt the cold gaze of the court continuing to press down on him. He did not know what to think. Every word uttered by the prosecutor left a heavy mark in his soul, and every word of the lawyer seemed but a faint hope. "Max," said the lawyer, when the judge announced a break. "Hold on, we're with you. I know it's hard for you now, but it's important that you don't lose faith in the truth. You tell it like it is, and we'll get justice." Max's mom, Martha, stood nearby, her face full of concern. She put her hand on her son's shoulder and whispered softly, "You are not alone, Max. We will fight to the end. You believe me, don't you?" Max nodded weakly, but there was still fear in his eyes. He wasn't sure of himself, and his inner struggle with himself seemed impossible. How could things have turned out like this? He was just an ordinary kid, after all. What if the court didn't believe what he said? What if everything turned out to be really against him? The lawyer took a step back, giving them some space. He watched carefully and tried to gauge how the situation would unfold. He knew that this case wasn't just a legal game, it was something more. A trial in which an innocent child was at the center of heavy accusations was becoming more dramatic by the day. The lawyer realized that they could lose this trial if they couldn't handle the pressure. Martha at this point felt her own strength melting away. She stood beside her son, her heart clenched with pain as she saw Max suffering. She mentally apologized to him for not being able to protect him at that moment. When her son was in custody, she had thought she could do anything to help him. But now she felt powerless. When the court reopened, Max returned to his seat and all eyes were once again focused on him. The prosecutor stood at his side of the room, his expression unchanged. He continued to look at Max as the object of his accusation, but there was no compassion in his eyes. He was a professional, and his job was to accuse. "So, we continue," the judge said, looking around at everyone present. "There are several important things to consider in this case. I asked the prosecution to present additional evidence." The prosecutor stood up, his face stone-faced. "We present evidence that the pendant was found in the backpack of the accused. This fact leaves no room for doubt. It is a key piece of evidence in our case. We are also ready to present the testimony of witnesses who will confirm that the accused was in the immediate vicinity of the scene, which indicates his involvement in the theft," said the prosecutor, not hiding his confident mood. The prosecutor's words once again stabbed into Max's heart. His fear intensified and he involuntarily clenched his fists. There was no room in his mind for any other thoughts but a sense of hopelessness. His fingers were damp with sweat and his breathing was hitching. The lawyer stood up, his expression calm, but that didn't mean he didn't feel the gravity of what was happening. "Honorable court," he said, addressing the judge and the prosecutor. "We understand that the prosecution has presented certain evidence, but it is worth noting that the accused, as a minor, is under stress and uncertainty. We believe that it is impossible to draw definitive conclusions based on the mere fact of the pendant being in the backpack without investigating more deeply how this object could have ended up in Max's possession. The lawyer paused, gathering his thoughts. His task was not just to prove Max's innocence, but also to show that the accusation was based only on assumptions, without real evidence. We insist that a more thorough investigation is necessary, he continued, taking a step closer to the judge. We ask the court to take into account all the circumstances and allow a more detailed investigation of the case. The judge nodded silently, his gaze was cold, but a slight doubt could be seen in his eyes. He realized that this case could have serious consequences. Then the prosecutor rose again to object. "Dear court," he said, "I cannot agree with the defense's statement. The evidence speaks for itself. The pendant was found in the knapsack, and on that basis it can be said that the accused was involved in the theft. There is no need to waste time on lengthy research when the obvious facts have already been presented." The judge took the floor again. "We will continue the hearing tomorrow," he announced. "Each side may present additional evidence. This hearing is adjourned." Max stood up again, his legs shaking, and he hardly realized what was happening. He felt his world crumbling and there was nothing he could do about it. Martha walked over to her son, put her hand on his shoulder, and he felt her support. However, his inner restlessness did not leave him. In his heart he knew that this was not the end, but nevertheless this day was a real test for him. The lawyer approached them, his face remained calm, but there was determination in his eyes. "We will fight to the end," he said with a confident tone. "Don't give up, Max. We will do everything we can to prove your innocence." The trial continued, and despite the fact that Max's lawyer, Lodek, tried to remain calm, he was well aware of the complexity of the situation. He sat in his office, surrounded by documents, with a heavy look, concentrating on the materials of the case. In his hands there were testimonies, protocols, photos, but all this did not give him a clear answer to the question that tormented him from the beginning: how to find evidence of Max's innocence, when all the evidence says otherwise? At the trial, everything went according to the prosecution's plan. The prosecutor was sure that he was right, and the judge, despite his outward neutrality, already seemed biased. Lodek knew that his task was not just to challenge the prosecution, but to create a defense strategy that could turn the case in their favor. His approach was systematic. He gathered information, double-checked the facts, and looked for opportunities to introduce additional evidence that could not only weaken the prosecution's case, but destroy it completely. It's important to find witnesses who can confirm that Max was not in the room where the pendant disappeared, the lawyer thought, mentally running through the possible options. We need to find those who saw him at the time of the incident or who can add something to the case. He dialed the number of an old acquaintance of his who worked in another part of town and often encountered similar situations. This man could be helpful in locating potential witnesses. "Vlodek, I need you for an important task," he said into the phone, getting straight to the point. "We need to find someone who can confirm that Max was not in the room when the pendant went missing. That could be key to our case." The man on the other side of the line thought for a few seconds and replied, "I see. I'll check what I can do and let you know. But you realize it's not that easy." "I know," the lawyer replied. "But if we find it, it could play a key role." After some time, the lawyer decided to visit Max's house to talk to his mother in person. He felt it was necessary to be close to the family, to help them not only in court but also outside of it. It was important to create an atmosphere of trust so that they felt his support every step of the way. "Martha," he said when she opened the door, "I thought it would be best to meet and discuss the details. We need to prepare for the next meeting. I know it's hard, but I believe we can find a solution." Martha, standing in the doorway, looked at him appreciatively. "Lodek, we don't know what to do. Every day, every hour in this trial is getting more horrible. Max is innocent, but everyone around him thinks he is, and it's breaking us." The lawyer sighed and nodded. "I understand," he said as he entered the house. "We need to check every step, every detail, to make a defense plan. It might be worth going to witnesses who can confirm that Max wasn't in the room when the pendant went missing. But to do that, we need to act quickly. Martha nodded silently and escorted the lawyer into the room, where they began to sort out the details. All the talk around them sounded like empty words until there was some new twist in the case. Lodek realized that every step mattered. We should also pay attention to the surroundings of the house, he continued. Who might have noticed something important that could affect the case? I'll try to find people who could confirm that Max wasn't involved. Martha, gritting her teeth, agreed. She knew that everything depended on it, not only her son's fate, but their lives as well. She couldn't allow herself to doubt, but fear still sat in her heart. Lodek worked through the night, going over the case files, jotting down new thoughts and ideas. He felt he had to do something meaningful. Finding himself in the middle of this fight, he knew the case would not be easy. But if he could take even a small step toward the truth, it was worth it. The next morning, the lawyer met with a few acquaintances who might be able to help locate witnesses. He decided to talk to people who knew Max and his family, who could attest to his innocence. This step was important, because if someone actually saw Max not being in the room, it could be a key point. We're on the verge, he thought as he ended the calls. But if we can get everything together in time, we have a chance. Max sat in his office, staring out the window at the rain pounding on the glass. His thoughts were occupied with only one thing: how should he proceed? He could hear the lawyer discussing defense strategy, but he didn't know how it would end. His condition was getting worse by the day, and he could feel his strength gradually running out. But he couldn't give up. He had to have faith that his defense would make it through. More and more people came to the lawyer's aid, and even small witnesses began to claim that they had seen Max elsewhere at the time of the accident. Every step, every call from the lawyer brought them closer to an answer, even though Max himself felt trapped. But all this work, all the lawyer's efforts were not in vain. One evening, as Max sat with the lawyer in his office, his face suddenly brightened. "We found a witness," the lawyer said, handing him a document. "He confirmed that you were elsewhere when the pendant went missing. This evidence could play a key role in your case." Max couldn't believe his ears. "Really?" he whispered, unable to hide his joy. "So we have a chance?" The lawyer, his face finally blurring into a slight smile, nodded. "Yes, Max. We have a chance." The trial continued, and each day brought new worries for Max and his mother. Amidst the excitement and uncertainty, Max's lawyer, Lodek, kept looking for ways to change the course of the case, in hopes of finding a solution. All he could do was to scrutinize every fact, study documents, and try to find the slightest clues that could help in the defense. But despite his best efforts, no one wanted to hear the truth. The prosecutor was sure he was right, and the judge seemed to be leaning more and more to the side of the prosecution. It was hard to see how the course of the trial could be reversed. Meanwhile, the defense lawyer was doing a lot of work. He collected a lot of materials, looking for evidence that could help prove Max's innocence, but all of this had not yet been successful. Preparations for the next court hearing, which was due in a few days, were at their peak. Lodek was deciding what would be his next move. But everything changed in an instant. Everything happened unexpectedly. One morning, as the lawyer was going through another set of documents, a stranger came to him. It was a middle-aged man, with a nervous and tense expression on his face. He stood a little confused in the doorway of the office, as if he didn't know how to start the conversation. The lawyer looked up, immediately noticing the anxiety in his eyes. "You need someone?" Lodek asked, scrutinizing the visitor. I know something important about the Max Lechman case," the man answered in a lowered voice, as if he was afraid of being overheard. "I know who is really guilty of the theft." These words shook the lawyer. He rose quickly from his seat, looking eagerly and curiously at the stranger. "Who are you?" he asked, restraining his excitement. "And why did you choose to speak of this now?" The man looked around carefully, as if checking if it was safe to speak. Then, with a deep sigh, he began his story. "My name is Pavel," he began. I worked at Mrs. Werner's house a few months ago. I see you have already guessed that I know something important. Now, I saw her hide the pendant when it wasn't in her hand. And I know she did it for a reason. Vlodek felt his heart quicken its rhythm. He listened more closely to the man, who explained exactly how the pendant had ended up in Max's house, but not in the way everyone thought. Paul had not witnessed the theft, but his testimony opened up a whole new perspective. It wasn't just stolen, Paul continued, but prepared. I saw Mrs. Werner telling her maid that she wanted to get rid of her jewelry. She said she didn't trust the neighbors and had decided to hide the pendant in Max's knapsack, so that if anything happened she could accuse him of stealing it. I didn't want to see that, but I couldn't keep quiet. The lawyer sat there confused. All this time, while they were trying to prove Max's innocence, the true culprit had remained close by. Vlodek felt the real picture of what had happened unfolding before him. Why did you decide to tell about it? The lawyer asked, trying to understand the man's motives. Pavel was silent for a moment, and then with a heavy sigh he continued. I couldn't live with it in peace. You know what it's like when you realize someone is innocent and the other person gets something that doesn't belong to them. Ms. Werner will not stop. She will be able to manipulate everyone to justify her actions. I couldn't just watch a child's life crumble because of her lies. Vlodek nodded. He realized that now he had a chance. Pavel may not have been a key witness, but his testimony was important and could completely change the course of the case. It all seemed like the stone they had been looking for a long time, and now it was in their hands. Let's get this formalized, the lawyer said, rising from his chair. We need you to give formal testimony in court. It will not only help Max, but also protect you from possible consequences. Pavel looked around, as if checking the safety of his words again. I'm ready, he answered. But please take care of my safety. I can't stay in the city after all this is revealed. Vlodek realized how seriously Pavel took his security. This was not just a man who happened to know about a crime. This was a man who knew ulterior motives that could turn the case upside down. We'll make sure you're safe, the lawyer promised. Let's start by you telling us everything you know. All the details. Pavel told them a few more important facts. He described the moments when Mrs. Werner openly expressed her displeasure with the people in her entourage and her willingness to use any means to hide her actions. He also described how he saw her tense when she discovered the pendant missing and immediately suspected that one of the servants might have been involved in the theft. Paul's testimony proved critical to the development of the case. He revealed that Werner had created an entire scheme to accuse an innocent man of something she herself had arranged. It was quite possible that she even knew of Max's weaknesses, knowing how dependent his family was on her. Vlodek realized that the situation was now drastically different. Not only could they prove that Max was innocent, but they could charge Mrs. Werner with trying to manipulate the situation for her own gain. We'll make this case, Paul, the lawyer said confidently, stroking his chin. We will win. Vlodek didn't put the case on hold. He immediately contacted the lawyers who had prepared a defense strategy for Max and arranged a meeting to prepare for a new trial. Paul gave his testimony, which was now becoming an integral part of the defense. Meanwhile, the situation in court was not so clear-cut. Werner, despite all her confidence, felt that her position was beginning to falter. The trial continued, but uncertainty hung in the air, and all sides began to prepare for a drastic change of game. The last court session was scheduled for the morning. Everyone in the room felt that today would be a decisive day, and its outcome could forever change the lives of all the participants in the trial. Throughout the trial, the atmosphere had been tense and the outcome seemed uncertain. But now, after months of struggle, Max's lawyer Vlodek finally felt that the moment had come when the truth had to be revealed and all the cards had to be laid bare. Max sat in his chair, absorbed in thought. His hands were trembling, but he tried not to show his excitement. He knew that today was the most important day of his life. The jewelry theft trial had been so intense and stressful that every moment felt like a test. But now, after their defense presented new evidence, everything could change. He searched the eyes of his mother, Martha, who sat next to him. She looked at him with concern and hope, but her face was tired. She had been through so many difficult moments, so many sleepless nights because of fear for her son, that even now, at this crucial moment, she couldn't feel completely confident. But Max was sustained not only by her love, but also by the lawyer's faith. Today was finally the climax. The court hearing began with the usual formalities. The judge called everyone to order again, and the prosecutor, as usual, made his accusations. "Honorable court," began the prosecutor, standing at the podium. "We cannot ignore all the facts that point to the guilt of the accused. We have presented all the evidence. The pendant was found in his backpack, and all the evidence points to the fact that he was at the scene of the crime. Today, however, the defense was ready for the decisive moment." Vlodek stood up, raising his head, and calmly walked toward the podium. His face was calm, but his eyes gave away the tension. He knew that today everything would be decided. "Honorable court," he began, his voice sounding confident, "we do not deny that the pendant was found in my client's backpack. But we have proved that he could not have been involved in the crime, because it was simply planted there. That's not just an accusation, it's a fact supported by the evidence we've gathered. I ask you to listen carefully to what we are prepared to present." The judge nodded and pointed to the prosecutor so that he could also object. The prosecutor immediately stood up, his face hard. "This is absurd!" he shrieked. "There is no evidence that the pendant was planted. We have all the necessary material to prove that Max Lechman is guilty. It is obvious that the defense is trying to exonerate him by any means necessary." But at that moment, the hall fell silent. A new witness came through the door, a man no one knew about. It was Paul, a former employee of Mrs. Werner's house, who had witnessed her hiding the pendant, and now, after a long silence, had decided to tell the truth. Vlodek, not expecting this turn, immediately realized that they had their chance. He stood up, a little confused, but quickly pulled himself together and turned to the judge. "I ask you to listen to this man," the lawyer said. "This is our witness, and his testimony can dramatically change the situation." Pavel nervously approached the podium. His face was tense, but he held back his fear. He realized that his testimony could not only help Max, but could jeopardize everything Ms. Werner had built. "Tell us what you know," the judge asked. Paul looked at the audience and began to speak, his words sounding clear despite his nervousness. "I worked at Mrs. Werner's house a few months ago," he began, and everyone in the room froze. "I saw her hide the pendant when she noticed it wasn't in her possession. I witnessed her tell the maid that she was going to accuse someone to get rid of the jewelry. She figured that if anyone was guilty, it would be Max Lechman. I couldn't keep that quiet. She hid it in Max's backpack." The audience gasped. People began to look around, the prosecutor was dumbfounded. The judge stood up, scrutinizing the witness's face. "That's a lie!" shrieked the prosecutor, losing his composure. "It's a lie! This man cannot be a trusted source. His testimony has no value." But the judge was more restrained. "We will continue the trial," he said. "We need time to sort out the new facts." Everyone present was stunned. A witness who had suddenly appeared had given information that could have completely changed the outcome of the case. Now it was not a matter of proving Max's guilt, but of recognizing the true culprit. Vlodek smiled despite the tension. This was the turning point. They were finally able to question the accusations and expose the real culprit. Max sat in his seat, unable to believe what was happening. He looked up at the lawyer, who was now confident of success. Paul, his testimony was the key that opened the door of truth. Max felt his chest fill with air, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel trapped. The trial continued, but now everything was going in favor of the defense. The prosecutor, seeing how the situation was escalating, was no longer so sure of his victory. His face became gloomy, he began to realize that the situation was getting out of control. Vlodek, wasting no time, continued to develop his line of defense. He was going to prove that Pavel's testimony was not only true, but was supported by other circumstantial facts. The pendant that had been found in Max's backpack had not been stolen by him. It had been planted to incriminate the boy, and that was now becoming clear. At the next hearing, when the prosecutor tried to challenge the witness, Lodek, relying on all the new evidence, presented a new list of witnesses who could confirm Max's innocence. Each new word the lawyer said weakened the prosecution's position more and more. He spoke confidently and clearly, his words leaving no doubt that Max was innocent. The judge, despite his restraint, began to ask questions of the prosecutor to which he could not give convincing answers. The case began to take a whole new turn, and the atmosphere in the room became more tense than ever. The prosecutor, tired of the constant counter-arguments, stood up and said that he needed time to evaluate the new evidence. The judge, realizing the significance of what was happening, called a recess. Max breathed a sigh of relief. He knew his life could change right now. In that moment, he realized that everything he and his lawyer had been fighting for could finally come to fruition. Everything that had happened over the past weeks had led up to the final moment. Max Lehman's trial was coming to a close, and now that the recess had been read and all the new testimony had been examined, all that was left to do was wait for the verdict. All this time Max and his family lived in constant tension. Every day was like a battle, where the stakes were getting higher and higher, and every step could be decisive. Martha sat in the courtroom, her hands folded in a lock, her gaze fixed on her son. Every gesture he made, every word he spoke, was under the scrutiny of everyone present. In that moment she felt the weight of responsibility for her son resting on her shoulders, not just her pain. She experienced every minute as if it were her own ordeal. With each day, with each new witness, her anxiety grew, and despite the efforts of the lawyer, despite the positive turnaround that seemed imminent, she still felt her soul tormented by anxiety. Max sat beside her, his face tense. He knew that everything he had experienced could have ended here, in this meeting. His thoughts wavered between doubt and hope. His eyes were tired, but there was a glimmer of hope in them that the appearance of the witness Paul had brought. He did not believe that all this could end in a real victory, but at the same time he could not let go of the thought that his life would finally have a chance for normalcy. Lodek stood aside, watching carefully all the movements of the judge, the prosecutor, and the witnesses. He knew that the case was still far from over, but he was sure that with every step the defense was getting closer to victory. Everything he had prepared over the weeks, every fact, every piece of evidence, starting with Paul's testimony, was part of a carefully thought-out plan. He was prepared to fight to the end for his belief in the truth. When the judge announced that the hearing would begin, everything in the room went quiet. The audience froze in anticipation. The judge stood up, his gaze was serious, and everyone present realized that now they would hear not just a decision on the case, but a decision that would determine the fate of all those involved in this process. "Dear members of the court," began the judge, his voice sounded firm and restrained. "We have considered all the evidence and testimony presented. We have heard the prosecution and the defense, and now it is time to rule on the case." He paused briefly, giving everyone present time to focus on the decision to be made. In view of the new evidence presented by the defense, as well as the lack of direct evidence of the defendant's guilt, the court finds that the prosecution has not presented a sufficient basis for affirming Max Lehmann's guilt of the crime. The hall was deafeningly silent. Everyone expected the next words to follow, but until the last moment no one knew what the final form of the decision would be. When the judge continued, the last phrase was uttered, which shook everything in the hall. "Therefore, the court acquits Max Lehmann of all charges." Martha exhaled and tears of relief appeared in her eyes. She hugged Max, who stood there in disbelief at what was happening. At that moment, as the verdict was announced, his world seemed to crumble and everything suddenly fell into place. He didn't know what to make of this feeling, but he knew one thing for sure: his life had been saved. The lawyer, Lodek, felt the heavy weight he had been carrying finally lifted off his shoulders. It was a victory not only for Max, but also for himself. He had traveled this road together with his client, and now, despite the gravity of the case, he knew that he had not made a mistake. The prosecutor stood where he was, not hiding his disappointment. His face was grim, and his eyes expressed irritation and displeasure. He had probably not expected this turn of events, and his confidence in victory seemed to melt away at that moment. It was hard to admit that the prosecution had failed, that their attempts to prove Max's guilt had failed. Vlodek walked over to Max and his mother, feeling the tension in the room slowly fade away, replaced by relief. "We've won, Max," he said with a smile, though his voice was still heavy from the experience. "You're free." Max stood there, unable to answer immediately. Words were just superfluous at this moment, when his heart was overflowing with emotion. He hugged his mom, and despite the severity of the ordeal, they both felt the world around them begin to change. After the verdict was announced, a new chapter in the life of Max and his family began. All the heaviness they had been carrying disappeared in an instant, leaving room for new emotions, joy, relief, and even surprise. But the story doesn't end there. No matter how many words of joy they spoke, there were consequences ahead that they had to deal with. Max and his mom returned home, but now everything seemed different. The home that had once seemed a place of comfort and peace was now filled with memories of the suffering and fears they had endured. Nevertheless, a spark of hope burned in their eyes. All that they had endured now seemed to be behind them, and they had a new life ahead of them. After the verdict was pronounced, Max and his family's lives began to slowly return to normal. However, everything they had experienced over the past few months had left a deep mark on their hearts and souls. The emotions they felt were multi-layered: joy at being vindicated, relief at the end of a nightmare, but at the same time a sense of loss and anxiety for the future. Martha, his mother, felt bitterness and relief at the same time. On the one hand, she was happy that her son would no longer be in prison, but on the other hand, she knew that all this had left an unhealed wound in their family. They had lost a lot. She had no doubt in her mind that Max shouldn't have been in this position. The injustice they had faced couldn't help but affect her perception of the world. When they got home, the house didn't seem so warm and cozy anymore. It felt like a place where a threat hung over them, and she felt it every time she stepped on its doorstep. But now that it was over, she was beginning to realize how important it was to believe in your loved ones and support them despite all the trials they were going through. Max felt lost, as if he didn't know how to go on with his life. He sat at the window and looked at the street, where life went on, and his world seemed to be upside down. Before he had lived an ordinary life, studies, friends, but now he was a different person, and this experience changed him fundamentally. The fear of the future did not leave him, despite his excuses. He didn't know how to restore his inner balance and gain confidence. He was free, but that freedom didn't bring him as much joy as he had expected. Weeks passed, and things were becoming a little clearer. Vlodek, Max's lawyer, continued to stay by his side, trying to help not only with legal matters, but also to support him psychologically. He knew that the process of Max's acquittal was not only a legal challenge, but also a life challenge. He understood that Max now had to rebuild his life. But he had a sense that this was not only his client's challenge, but also his own lesson in the importance of defending justice. One evening, as Max and his mother sat together, Vlodek came over to talk to them. He felt it was time to complete the process, and to help the family realize what lessons they had learned from what had happened. He realized that many things would never be the same, but now was the time to think about the future. "Max," he began, sitting down across from him, "I know things still seem strange. But we've come a long way with you. Not only have you won in court, you've learned a lot, and most importantly, you've learned to fight for your truth." Max was silent, absorbed in his thoughts. "I know how you feel," the lawyer continued, "but look at what we have now. You're free, you have the opportunity to start over, and this is your chance to build your life anew. You've been through adversity, and now you know how important fortitude is." Martha, sitting next to him, looked at her son and the lawyer. She realized that everything they had said was true, but how could they get back all that they had lost over the months? How to believe that the world would be just again? "Vlodek is right," she said quietly. "We've been through this, but you, Max, now you know how important it is to stand up for the truth, despite everything that's going on around you." Max looked up. He realized that his life had changed. But now that he was vindicated, he didn't know how to move on. He felt that this experience had left a deep mark on him, and he wasn't sure if he could believe in people again. His trust in the world had been shattered, and he didn't know how to get it back. Vlodek, watching him, continued. You are not alone, Max. You've been through tremendous pain, but you've made it. You learned to face the truth, and that's an important lesson for life. This whole situation has made you stronger than you realize. Max nodded slowly, feeling the weight on his shoulders become a little lighter. He couldn't immediately believe the lawyer's words, but deep down he felt they were right. He knew he had a long way to go to restore his faith in people and in justice, but now he was ready to move on. He realized that this experience must not be in vain. He must learn to live with it and use it as a lesson. A few months passed and Max and his family's life was slowly being rebuilt. He went back to school, but now every day was a challenge for him. He tried to rebuild his relationships with his friends, but a lot had changed. His previous relationships with the people around him, with whom he used to feel confident, had become much more difficult. He realized that his life would not be the same now. He became more cautious, more closed off, and felt that the world around him had changed as well. However, despite all these changes, he was slowly regaining his normalcy. He began to trust people again, albeit cautiously. He realized that the world wasn't perfect, and that justice wasn't always on his side. But now he was willing to fight for it, no matter how many times he had to face injustice. Martha, for her part, realized that she not only needed to support her son, but also to work on herself. Her faith in the system had been shattered, but now she knew that even in the most difficult situations, it was possible to find a path to justice. She no longer allowed herself to look at the world with worry and fear. She realized that she needed to act to prevent similar situations from happening again in the future, and her inner sense of justice became stronger. Vlodek, a lawyer, continued to support them, realizing that his role in this story was more than just legal. He was helping the family regain confidence in truth and justice, and realized that it was moments like these that made his work meaningful. He was grateful for the opportunity to be involved in this case because it exposed him to important lessons about human resilience and the search for truth. When the trial was over, each of them realized that this fight for the truth was not only legal, but personal. Not only did they get justice for Max, but they learned important lessons that will follow them throughout their lives. Max, despite the difficulties, realized that this experience had become important to him. He was no longer the same person he had been before all this started. He had become more mature, more confident, and most importantly, he had learned to fight for his truth. Martha now saw the world through the lens of a new understanding. She knew that despite all obstacles, the love and support of family is what can overcome any difficulty. And this experience taught her not only to fight for justice, but also to appreciate every moment that life has to offer. Thank you for walking this journey along with the characters in this story. I hope this story about the power of family, forgiveness, and new beginnings has inspired you and reminded you of the importance of support and love even in the most difficult times. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your impressions and comments. Your thoughts and feedback are very important and inspire new stories. Subscribe and give us a like so we don't miss new stories. I apologize for any errors in the text. Thank you for your understanding and support.